Right, good afternoon. Good morning to those in the US. Good afternoon, good evening to those in the UK and Europe. We've gone 2 minutes past the hour, so we might as well get started. Welcome to November's CISO briefing on authorization by the Cyber Hut. My name is Simon Moffatt, founder and analyst at the Cyber Hut. And authorization is a hugely fascinating and broad topic which I've been tracking for a number of years, and hopefully we'll get into a bit of a journey as to why authorization is suddenly now becoming much more important. A few housekeeping things to go through before we dive in. Clearly, we're on Zoom today. So everyone is centrally muted. Of course, we do have the chat and the Q&R functionality up and running. So feel free to add in any comments and questions as we go along. We will be leaving probably 5 or 6 minutes at the end to wrap up any questions that I don't answer as we go through, but feel free to use those facilities as we progress. This is being recorded as well, so you will get an email in a few days to watch on demand or share with your colleagues as you see fit. Today's agenda, go on a bit of a journey, really. Authorization has been around for a number of years in various different guises, in different implementations, and different approaches. So a little bit of a backtrack as to where we were, then clearly where we are, and a little bit of a landscape review. So by that I mean looking at some of the vendors and some of the suppliers and technology startups that have emerged over the last sort of 3 to 4 years. Then a bit of a stab at where authorization is heading next, which I think is always quite interesting. Everyone always asks analysts, we always get inquiries all the time, what's going to happen next, where we're heading, what's happening with this company or vendor or trend. So it's always quite fun, I think, to try and guess what might happen in the next 2 to 3 years. So we'll wrap up on that towards the end. First of all, who the heck are the Cyber Hut? Why are we sort of talking or qualified to talk about access control and authorization? So my name is Simon Moffatt. I've been in the identity space just over 21 years, which is a little bit scary when I say that out loud. But I'm a founder and analyst at the Cyber Hut. And the Cyber Hut has been around for about 18 months, I guess, as an advisory analyst entity. And really my sort of history and focus has been in both workforce and in consumer identity. Did a bit of research on the consumer stuff about 18 months ago, released a book, and now I spend a lot of my time looking at these emerging patterns in both the workforce, the consumer space, data security, API security, and so on, and also co-host a podcast called The Week in Identity as well, which is a bit of an analyst rant as to all of the current affairs in the identity and access management world. The Cyber Hut really is trying to help the industry, I guess, in two fronts, really. Trying to help the buy side be more aware and more informed of identity and access management technology trends, emerging use cases, capabilities, trying to decipher that, for want of a better term or a pun, if you like, to make it more accessible. Identity is complex, it's nuanced, lots of acronyms, lots of differences, lots of emerging technology trends, and we try and do that through a host of open source analysis, buyer guides, vendor assessments, podcasts, advisory work, consultancy. But it's essentially trying to make more information available around some of the complexities within the IAM space. Things like the CISO briefings are part of that process. Who do we work with? 3 main actor sets, really. I just literally come off a call before this with investor community. Investors hugely interested in IAM, things like due diligence, things like understanding the markets and where vendors are heading to. And we also work with both the buy side and the sell side in understanding the technology trends, understanding what identity can do, where it's heading, where has it been in the past, what's worked, what hasn't worked. And those sort of 3 pillars are the main areas where we work with. And from a buy side perspective, clearly, most organizations are looking to invest in identity technology, be that authentication, authorization, data security, session management, consumer identity, whatever it can be. And there are several different pillars where the cyber hut helps them, whether it's through things like vendor assessments and buyer's guides, training, maturity assessments, assessing and understanding existing technology, and obviously helping them with procurement advisory decisions as well. Um, oops. Another, I guess, area where we're heavily invested, if you like, is the CISO community. I think the last probably 3 to 4 years, I think the CISO and the CIO have become heavily involved in the identity procurement and design, if you like, of identity, instead of identity being just a sort of operational and IT reactive function. It's now very much a business enabler. So we do a whole host of CISO advisory work, which we sort of set up in like 6, 7 months ago, I guess, looking at things like value discovery, looking at market understanding, product understanding. How can a CISO best select and best understand identity technology for both consumers, for workforce, and for things like authorization as well? And I think the big thing around the CISO sort of overlay is that strategic view of identity, and how can identity really provide value into other parts of the business. So we're heavily involved in things like identity workshops in there as well, and looking at architecture review and trying to provide a bit of guidance around how identity can provide value, things like data collaboration or business enablement or joint ventures, and so on. And last thing to quickly mention as part of that buy side is training. I think consumer identity, authentication, authorization, API protection, it's difficult, it's complex. So we provide a whole host of both online and masterclass training. Our next training package is going to be on the entire authentication market, which is going to be getting released in January. So that's a thing we're looking forward to as well. But alas, today the focus is on authentication. And I mentioned earlier, I want to go on a little bit of a journey, I guess, and it makes sense really to start with, I guess, authorization is to where we were maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And I guess there's two things to clear up, I think. Authentication and authorization have often been used interchangeably, often quite erroneously. I think we can all agree, but I guess it's a good starting point is to the role of authentication, so that verification and validation of an identity. And I guess there's a few things which need to happen. On the left hand side, there's things like the ability to register and enroll into a system. And then there's the analysis of things like biometrics, maybe location information, things like credential management, if we're looking at things like passwordless and sort of challenge response based logins. But the end goal of authentication is typically two things: some sort of assurance that the identity is who they say they are, in some sort of session, and the session being a time related component. And the interesting angle really is that the output of authentication is then being pushed into authorization. So what can the individual, or maybe a service, but what can the individual really do within those downstream systems? And here we're looking at subject related information, maybe coming from a token or an assertion of some sort. But more importantly, we're looking at the systems that they want to have access to, the objects. What actions can they perform against those objects? And to do that, we need an authorization engine or some sort of decision mechanism. And into that decision mechanism, we punch in all of our context, our history, our identity information, permissions, groups, and so on. And the output of that authorization decision is going to be the interesting stuff. So things like access decisions, transaction decisions. Can something be shared? Can something be opened? Can an event or a transaction be completed? Under what actions or conditions can and should it be completed? And really clear, this is the main bulk of what we want to talk about today. And it's interesting how authorization has become much more powerful. It's become much more of a business enabler over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, and that's, I guess, the journey we want to discuss in the next sort of 45 minutes. The other thing I want to mention really is the sort of where we were in the past tense, really, was the focus of access control from a homegrown solution. So organizations typically have had that history of building access control and authorization solutions themselves. There's a whole host of reasons why they may have done that. Maybe skills, maybe a lack of commercial product, maybe it was a very complex specialist system that they wanted to protect. But I think what we're starting to see today with a whole host of new use cases is that there's some limitations in those homegrown systems. Things like the hard-coded users and groups is a pretty obvious one, but the inability to extend, issues around not using principle of least privilege and stale permissions, excess permissions, lack of governance, lack of ability to improve those solutions. And the real weakness of this really is inhibiting the business. It's not just an IT or a security problem, but it's reducing the ability for the business to be agile. It's reducing the ability to share data to the right people, have that whole sort of increased risk, reduced security angle to talk about. And that data collaboration and ability to share data, the right people, the right time, and doing that fast is a huge problem. And I think that really is now becoming a real it's becoming a topic on the inquiries that I receive from enterprise architects, CIOs, CISOs, because they're saying, well, look, I want to share some data. I want to go make an acquisition and I can't share data. I need to go into a joint venture to launch a new product and I can't open my APIs up. They don't really necessarily realize that's an access control problem, but that lack of business agility is really sort of hindering and impacting how the business works. And I think that now is suddenly why, or one of the reasons why authorization has become slightly more relevant over the last sort of 2 to 3 years. And the question I always ask, I think I've riffed on this a few times over the years, does security really start when authentication ends? And suddenly when we move into this space of authorization, is this really when we actually start the security journey? Maybe it's a bit of an anecdote in that one as well. Let's quick look on the questions. Questions come in. More an observation. Not all things you reference about the indication are required. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Thank you. So authorization has been around for a while. Currently, its role is important, and the role is inhibiting how the business can operate. And where are we today? Why is things changing? I think there's a couple of angles that we've taken at the side to have a look at this. And one is, I guess, historical approach to authorization. Lots of acronyms in there. Some probably more popular than others. Things like RBAC and ABAC, so role-based access control, been around for a long time. I started my career looking at RBAC sort of 20 years ago or so, and I think it's still around, and I've just about recovered, I think, from those adventures doing role-based access control, but looking to group individuals in organizational business roles and trying to sort of abstract how you associate users to permissions. We then sort of evolved to a bit of attribute-based access control, which is still quite popular and effective today. API protection, leveraging things like OAuth 2, which has been around for a number of years. XACML, XML-based language for sort of describing access control logic is sort of been and gone, I guess, if you like. And then we started to look at some emerging things. It's like Zanzibar. It sounds like a tropical drink, but alas, it came out of some research from Google, which has proliferated out on various different projects over the last 2 to 3 years. And things like declarative control, so declaring your access control rules in various different projects which are on the go. So we have these tools and these capabilities that have been around, and it's interesting as to what's driving us to do something different today. And I think there's 2 areas here to consider. I think one is the modern enterprise, and by the modern enterprise, we are talking about the sort of mid to size organization. It's probably got distributed working probably may have some external identity capabilities, but it's going to be contending with managing hybrid cloud. It's probably got SaaS systems. It's probably got its own PaaS and platform as a service stuff in there as well. It's having to handle the API economy and microservices. How do you deploy at speed? How do you protect APIs and microservices? And then you've got more orthogonal issues, device integration, IoT security. I was at a conference yesterday in London, the Whitehall Media Conference, and interesting discussions around machine-to-machine authentication and authorization. And perhaps the non-person entity authorization is becoming a huge issue as well. APIs talking to APIs, machines talking to other machines, machines talking to APIs, chatbots, RPA, etc., etc. So suddenly there's a lot of stuff going on, and maybe the previous failures of RBAC and governance issues and the sort of bulkiness of XACML are driving us to look for something different. And things like zero trust, contextual access, adaptive access, adding on to that layer of complexity, which is really allowing an opportunity for authorization to become a real business benefit. Two things we observed when analyzing the sort of authorization space. Number one, the number of things in the workforce that need to be protected has increased pretty rapidly. This is a bit of a snapshot, if you like. There's certainly more things to protect than this, but I think there are a few things which are driving this. API first economy, absolutely. And those APIs are going to be written in a whole host of different languages, some cool, some legacy, but they need to be protected. Classic web applications still are not going anywhere. Typically in the past, you'd have that whole sort of portal ecosystem that would need to be protected. You then went to a situation where there was numerous libraries to essentially hard code access control logic in the sort of model view controller ecosystem, which I think many organizations are desperately trying to unpick these rules and these controls, which are hard coded into Java and .NET and other things. There's a whole host of different assets that need to be protected. Software as a service, federated systems if you're in joint ventures or in business-to-business ecosystems. You want to protect infrastructure these days, so things like Amazon or things like Kubernetes ecosystems where you have services and resources and compute power, which essentially it's the digital infrastructure which needs to be protected at quite a fine-grained level. You've got apps, you've got data which can be structured, it can be unstructured. That's a lot of stuff which suddenly both the security operations and identity teams need they need capabilities to service these application owners, product owners, digital leaders, and suddenly that creates huge limitations really on those homegrown approaches. It's a heterogeneous ecosystem. You need different ways of protecting, different ways of enforcing, and that I think is certainly driving a need for something different in the workforce. The other area of demand, if you like, is PII protection, personal identifiable information. In the consumer or customer world, clearly we have compliance as a driver here, things like GDPR, CCPA in the United States, the consumer data right in Australia in APJ. There's a lot of consumer compliance requirements. Personalization requires the handling of data. You need data from the end user into your service in order to deliver personalization, but then you need to protect that stuff. You need to protect information. And you look at the latest advertising by likes of Apple or Samsung and their Galaxy phones. It's all about privacy. It's all about how they can protect your PII, and they see that privacy protection as a competitive advantage. So suddenly any organization on the planet, doesn't need to be as big as Apple or Samsung, suddenly needs to be able to protect personal identifiable information and allow that protection to build trust, protect their brand. Nobody wants data leakages and data breaches, especially not if it contains things like medical information, biographical information, my history, my entire financial transactions, for example. Suddenly there's a lot of information flowing, through my mobile device, through my apps, online banking, retail, e-commerce, all of the things like movies and media that we consume. That information has to be shared to allow the service to operate, but it has to be protected in a way which gives power to the end user, but also clearly has to drive revenue and drive opportunity for the service provider. So suddenly you have to protect this PII. The assets are increasing in volume, increasing in complexity. We're talking about that API-led aspect as well, but also the data sharing angle there. How can you share individual pieces of data, whether it's JSON objects, whether it's SQL rows and columns, and being able to do that on a fine-grained basis to a whole host of different systems, and be able to enforce the policy or even create the policies in a very streamlined and simple way. And I think that is yet another driver for demand, and the demand generator, if you like, for access control and authorization capabilities. And this was an anecdotal thing we put on LinkedIn probably 3 or 4 months ago, I suppose, looking at the sort of migration of capabilities and requirements around authorization. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's certainly some interesting, I guess, mind changes which have taken place. I think in the past, it was all about being protective and being inhibitive and sharing less and things being high coded and static. Whereas clearly today, the modern organization, they want to share more to more people. And those people may not be within the organization. They may well be partnered, they may well be federated, they may well be consumers outside of the business boundary. So suddenly there's more stuff to be shared to more people. We need to look at a movement from things being hard coded to things like policies, where you can include context, you can include different sort of identity related attributes. You're looking at a whole host of different flexible enforcement options. The things you protect may well be in a host of different systems, different languages, different application types, on-prem, on cloud, etc. How can you, I guess, deliver this with the sort of onset of the cloud migration? Some of those components will be cloud related, maybe policy definition, maybe the systems you protect. So there's going to be a whole mixture of that hybrid landscape, if you like. And suddenly you have to deliver authorization, not just in your own data center, which is highly controlled, but maybe across cloud ecosystems with some of those SaaS components as well. So that stuff on the left hand side is really, some of it may still exist, but we're definitely moving to something slightly different with a modern set of requirements which allow us to share more to more people, which in turn allows the business to do more stuff. Want a quick dive into a bit of a landscape review. What's out there? What have we seen? What's sort of driving the response, if you like, to all of the problems we've been talking about? We talked about all the issues the enterprise is facing. It's got more stuff to protect. The stuff that it's protecting is more distributed. The end users that they need to give access to are no longer under their control. The users are some are employees, some are contractors, some are in the B2B ecosystem, some are consumers and citizens, some will also be non-person entities as well, services and things. So if you look at that as a set of problems, that's really pushed us to look at what some of those solutions may look like. And this is a bit of an anecdotal thing. This is a word cloud of 14 vendors in the access, permission, and authorization platform sectors. So that was 14 vendors out of a possible probably 28, 30 that sort of pulled out in some research. When you start to look at things like access request management, permission management, external authorization platforms, declarative authorization systems, even some of the access governance platforms today are starting to put their tentacles in how you can streamline the actual enforcement angle as well. And there's some interesting things which sort of pop out here. Clearly, authorization is a big one, but things like control, data, being policy led, I think is vitally important. Cloud, clearly, access models, access privileges, least privilege, zero trust, data security in there. Other couple of ones which are interesting, things like graph technology and relationship based technology. We've heard a lot of briefings over the last sort of 3 or 4 months around not so much the customer problem, but how some of those problems are being solved. And things like graph technology and relationships pop up in those conversations quite a lot, and how relationships are changing, the relationships between people, but between people and the things that they need access to, and how quickly can you essentially identify that subject to object relationship. How can you identify the actions or the permissions against those objects? And a lot of that is contextual. And by that I mean it's no longer Simon has access to this group, which gives me access to this file. That's quite a linear, quite an old-fashioned way of thinking about things. Whereas perhaps I'm a doctor, I need access to this patient's records as I'm, administering medicine to them. It's a contextual event. Other examples, things like help desk operatives. If you're a help desk worker or a call center worker, you may need access to a particular client file just for the duration that you are working on that particular client file. It's much more contextual and relationship led. Things like graphs can help that. So things like dynamic graph directories and graph databases are popping up in these word clouds as well as things like time-based access. Sort of an extension of that relationship is thing being related to time. So by that I mean the access given to a system is not it's not permanent. Essentially, it's time-based, which could be triggered by context. Working on a particular case, or maybe working in a particular location, or perhaps triggered by the end of an event. So if I stop working on a particular case, or that case closes, I should no longer have access to the production system because the ticket I was working on has closed. The duration that I needed the ephemeral access, if you like, has terminated, so the access is removed. So it's all about maybe just-in-time access and removing this reliance on things being known up front, and sort of hard coding those permissions, or knowing those permissions up front. Quick questions come through. Do you think businesses have protected their APIs, and to what extent is that needed? The hacking penetration testing community have said that APIs are going to be hot targets in the coming years as automation becomes more needed. I think it's a bit of it's a consequence of evolution. Most organizations have a huge API ecosystem. It's the open economy or the data economy, and to enable that to take place, APIs have proliferated over the last probably 5 or 6 years, I suppose. I think why have APIs and microservices especially become more prevalent? Well, I think there's a speed angle involved. How quick you can build something, how quick you can integrate something, how quick you can share something. Why is speed important? Well, I think many organizations are under significant both competitive and sort of agile pressures to deliver stuff quick. I think APIs allow them to do so. But I think there's quite a good level of community knowledge around API protection. Things like OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, is a good starting point for API protection. There's good methodologies around API protection and good patterns of behavior using things like OAuth 2 and gateways and intelligent proxies and things. So yes, there'll be targets, absolutely will, because APIs are everywhere. But I think many organizations know there will be a target and have a good set of resources to counteract that threat. If we sort of take a bit of a double click into the landscape, if you like, and this is a few sort of example patterns of or groupings, I suppose, based on what we've seen over the last few months, looking at some of these vendors. Number one is, okay, let's start on the right hand side actually. So number one, the existing platform providers, so the classic access management players. Ping and ForgeRock, been around for a long time, both now being acquired by a private equity firm. So it'll be interesting where they head to in the future. Auth0, also being acquired a year or so ago by Okta. But they've been around for a while. They don't just do authorization. They do a whole host of authentication, access management, session management, et cetera, but they do have authorization capabilities. So things like policy-based control, enforcement capabilities with gateways and agents and such, and Auth0 with sort of API-led querying and things. And I think Auth0 also have a Zanzibar playground where you can look at modern takes on authorization, looking at some of Google's research there. So they're all evolving. They're all adding in some authorization-led capabilities, even though there maybe not be a primary authorization player. And Ping Identity, they acquired a company called Symphonic 2 or 3 years ago now, I guess, a Scottish-based entity actually, but that was a dedicated authorization player. So they're adding in capabilities in there as well. And the bottom three there, the cloud service providers, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, not to be discounted. They all have authorization capabilities, even if it's just to manage their own ecosystem. So Amazon have their own sort of approach, their JSON-based approach to declaring roles and subject relationships and such. And they're all incrementally adding in the nuance of authorization stuff for some of their projects. So the dark grey is evolving and ticking over and continually growing as the market need also amplifies as well. But I guess the 3 or 4 buckets which are starting to emerge, and one is the development of authorization platforms, the likes of Axiomatics, Plain ID, a company called Signal there, or SGNL. They recently had a $12 million funding round looking at things like just-in-time access and zero-standing privileges. Styra, which is an organization behind the Open Policy Agent, looking to look at their sort of declarative authorization service. So they're all externalizing authorization away from not just the applications and the systems themselves, but perhaps maybe even the identity providers as well. So you have a specialist authorization platform that are looking to centralize policy, looking to involve other parts of the business, product leads, application owners, even business leaders, to help describe the access control and authorization functions that they need. And those authorization platforms are up there to I guess, capture those business requirements, convert that into policy, and then obviously push that policy down into the systems that are being protected. And those authorization platforms are certainly, likes of Axiomatics, Plain ID, been around for a while, and they're looking to deliver that specialist level of functionality. The other area, which is interesting, and it's like a sort of a hatchet dotted line there between the platforms and these rules systems, is the concept of declaration. So declaring the enforcement rules and policies into code, essentially, or into human readable code. So maybe stored in JSON or YAML files, for example. And those rules or those declarations are then being consumed by decision engines, and the likes of Open Policy Agent, been around for quite a while, which many of the authorization players here will leverage and integrate with. But there's 1 or 2 others, Kerberos, Acerto, OzoHQ, looking at different ways of, I guess, describing and declaring the logic which describes the subject and object relationships. John Doe can have access to this file, and you can read this file, and there's some contextual evaluation that you must go through to check if that is true before giving access. So it's all about that decision-making angle, if you like, the enforcement angle. Querying a service, can Simon access this under these conditions, under this context, and getting that answer back, or maybe enforcing the answer within APIs, infrastructure, applications. So that's an emerging area as well. And I guess further down, we're starting to see this sort of access and permissions management, or access and relationship management vendors, where they're looking to streamline the access request and access certification process. So yes, we've got some policies, and we may manage those policies in a platform. We're going to enforce them with OPA, but how do we get Simon to request access to the policy which has to be enforced on those systems downstream. And the likes of Indent, Conductor One, Authorize, they're all just tackling that in various different ways, looking to streamline how I can request access. How can we review that access? It's almost the IGA market. It's almost that identity governance and administration aspect where you're looking at access certification, access review, checking who has access to what, looking at the reviews that have been completed. Should they still have access? What's changed? And do we need to then make a change to the sort of credential management or permission management system, which is then in turn managed by the policy and or enforcement systems upstream. The final area just to consider as well is the emergence of these specialist data authorization players, like Visa and Immuta. And they're really focusing on the sort of structured, unstructured data aspect. It's an interesting specialism. I think some of the other sort of vendors we mentioned there on the right do dive into data security, Plain ID, Axiomatics. They'll provide some data enforcement capabilities, things like SQL and NoSQL and Snowflake and things. So it's interesting that the specialist data authorization is often quite template driven. So but by templates, I mean the sort of set of characterizations for things like compliance, for GDPR, CCPA, and other really specialist data handling requirements. So within those pieces of regulation, you have very explicit steps that you may need to adhere to with regards to data security. And that's where you have these sort of specialist data players who can identify data, they can classify data, they can put risk association ratings around that data, and then you can apply a template to go through and apply some out of the box controls. So that's yet another area, certainly in the data access space. If that data is not perhaps behind an API, it's being accessed natively by an application, that is another angle which we're starting to see emerge. I guess there's a few consistent sort of functionality requirements we're starting to see. Certainly this externalization of capabilities into a specialist set of components, whether that's called a platform or not. Definitely seeing this rise of policy-based authorization. So again, moving away from static relationships, have a policy which can wrap various different things that you want to protect, linking users to those assets, adding in context, adding in attributes and credentials and things. And enforcing against various different systems. So whether you use things like inline sort of intercepts, whether you use sort of dedicated services or microservices, things like APIs to do a query and enforce the results of those API-based queries. Things like SDKs, of course, are going to be important there. But you need to have a whole host of different enforcement options. It might not just be APIs. It might not just be on premises. It could well be the enforcement of infrastructure components, could be the enforcement of web or data or maybe SaaS-based systems as well. So where you enforce is, I guess, going to become broader. There's going to be more things to protect. So you need to have potentially a range of different enforcement options there. And deployment acceleration, as you'd expect, if we're talking about cloud, you're talking about DevOps, you're talking about sort of Kubernetes and Docker-based ecosystems. How can you rapidly deploy both the policy and the enforcement aspects of authorization quickly? Can you do that programmatically? Can you do this in a DevOps ecosystem where you're not having to, have like a complex change management process? It can be all automated, and you can remove the people involved in that deployment angle. I think is going to be important as well. And a few other sort of concepts to consider. Human-friendly policy design. So what does that mean? Well, clearly in the past, authorization was a very deep technical nerd sort of IT security thing to think about. It's very much now the case, maybe even line of business, product owners, application owners will be getting involved in the authorization design process, whether that's designing policies or maybe more simply looking at linking users to particular policies and that sort of credential management aspect. Runtime contextual analysis, I think that's another important aspect. So context, pulling in non-identity information, information around the event, information of the history of the individual user, and maybe some device or location information could be useful there, which is often used in the authentication space. And maybe that starts to pull in other intelligence signals, risk intelligence, threat intelligence. Certainly very interesting in the whole sort of PI protection consumer space, where you're looking at threat intel information. Has anything changed? Is the behaviors changing? Is this API being accessed differently? What intelligence can be wrapped around a particular request, thresholds, behaviors, and so on? And maybe internal threat intel, or it could well be external as well, based on things like indicators of compromise, IOC, if you're looking at pulling in threat intelligence information in there as well. What next? Where are we heading to? So we've the modern organization, it's complicated. It's got this hybrid cloud stuff. It has lots of different user communities. It's got to give those user communities access to things and assets in a whole host of different formats. It needs to do it quickly. It wants specialized authorization capabilities, which will allow it to be agile and to grow and to share more. But what does that look like for the next, maybe two to 3 years? And this is essentially based on a few things, based on things that we've heard from our inquiry from the buy side. What do they want to achieve over the next 2 to 3 years? What are those business problems that they are looking to fulfill? And also, obviously, working with the vendors as well to maybe hit their roadmaps as to where they're heading. So I guess a few things, the immediate sort of 12, 18 months, I guess. Homegrown migrations, organizations desperately want to move away from stuff they've built themselves. That migration to policy-led or policy-based authorization, using rules, using policies, which allows that productionization of authorization, specialist equipment, version control, reusable components. It's allowing that productionization of authorization within the enterprise, and with that comes metrics, measurement, success, but it allows authorization to start to be a real business enabler. So by that, we're talking about allowing the business to say, right, okay, I want to go into a joint venture, and that means I need to share these APIs with that organization who perhaps I don't trust. Maybe there's a federation aspect there, so we need to have a federated sort of identity ecosystem involved. And if you can productionize your authorization ecosystem, that process becomes essentially a business as usual activity. It's policy led. Your user community, what sort of constraints or what access control requirements you need to put in place to allow that to happen. And that it simply becomes a business function. It's not becoming a really complex security or identity problem there. So definitely moving to this productionization, definitely looking at components that are reusable. So integrating into the DevOps ecosystem, things like version control, things like file-based storage of policy and rule-based information, allowing that to be programmatically distributed and edited in an automated fashion. Use of context. I think context is a huge part of any sort of modern identity landscape, both for authentication as well as things like zero trust, identity-centric security, and so on. But pulling in non-identity data is going to start to become very, very important. And clearly, we've moved sort of 2 to 3 years out. We're starting to get a bit blurry, I suppose, in our accuracy here. But clearly, data is the new oil, whatever. It's a terrible quote, I think. But organizations run on data, their own and other people's, but organizations need that data and information to function, whether it's consumer data, business intelligence, whatever it could be. It has to be protected. It has to be integrated into an access control ecosystem in a very streamlined way, ability to classify it, protect it, see who has access to pieces of data. I think that is certainly a long-term pattern. And then certainly, with 3 years from now, looking at an optimized pattern for authorization. And by that, I mean, we're talking about repeatable sort of architecture patterns, design patterns. It becomes very much a well-defined part of the organization from an operating standpoint. So you have dedicated teams who manage identity today. How they manage the access control ecosystem will be highly optimized and repeatable. It'll be very, very well documented and able to sort of evolve and have a roadmap. I don't think the majority of organizations are there today, but I think there are certainly vast majority are on this timeline at some way, shape, or form. Certainly migrating from something homegrown, looking at policies, looking at rules, and then they're on that journey for automation as well, which I think will allow them to do more, which I think is the very, very the interesting aspect as to why authorization and access control, I think, has now become high in demand. I think time will tell, I guess, whether that timeline is accurate. It certainly resonates with the sort of vendors and the inquiries we've been having. But I think certainly access control and authorization is here to stay. And I think it is definitely part of the CISO and the CIO's arsenal around how they can secure the landscape and essentially do more with more people. One or two questions I think we've gone through. If there are any more questions, now is the time to put them into the chat. If not, we can aim to finish a few minutes early. Calls to action. Of course, reach out to the Cyber Hut online through all of the usual social channels. Sign up for the free open source content. If you're on the buy side, clearly CISO Advisory, we're getting a little bit booked up for the rest of this year, but clearly CISO Advisory hours are always available. Training packages, doing some training on authentication. Currently, we're looking to do our authorization online training, which will be starting in Q1. We've got I think it's like 5.5, 6 hours of online authorization design training, which we're going to be releasing soon. So that is certainly something to investigate as well. And tune into the podcast, the Weekend Identity podcast we launched recently, looking at all of the contemporary events around identity and access management in general. And if not, find us on social, reach out and let us know your views on the authorization and access control landscape. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, and until the next CISO briefing, stay safe.